So we're talking about where ethnicities are clustered or distributed spatially. This slide is showing us African Americans, and as you can see, African Americans are clustered or distributed actually in the South. This goes back to 8th grade history. So you remember with Miss Gandy that there were 12.5 million slaves brought over from Africa. We're going to talk about it later, that there's actually like 5% that ended up in the colonies here. Okay, so but we'll get into that in a little bit. All right. So as far as distribution goes, you see a large African American population here in the South, and then you can see there are areas up here. Okay, Detroit, Chicago. And we'll talk more about the Great Migration, the first Great Migration and the second Great Migration in a couple of slides. This slide is talking about Asian Americans. And so some of the first Asian Americans came from China during the gold rush, okay? They heard tales of this thing called Gamsan. It was Gold Mountain. And essentially what they're picturing are these mountains and mountains of gold. And so the Chinese come across, okay, you have to think about spatially, where are the Chinese, right? They're not going to come in on the Ellis Island side. They're going to be coming in on the West Coast side, and they're looking for gold. Well, unfortunately, all the gold was, there wasn't as much gold as they thought, or it had already been taken. And so the Chinese made their money doing laundry, right? Or selling pickaxes and shovels and things like that. Over here, so where is it? Hawaii. So Hawaii is, I think it's 40% Asian. So after World War II, when we bombed Japan, after we took over Japan essentially, we filled up Hawaii with a lot of workers from Japan. We had them working in sugar cane fields, in pineapple fields, and you can just see that the ethnicities, clustered in those areas there. Okay, and then this one's talking about Native Americans. So look at Alaska. Okay, heavily clustered or distributed in Alaska. Okay, and if we were showing Canada, you would see a lot there as well. Okay, a lot of Native Americans. Now, if you look at the continental United States, this picture here, you notice where they clustered, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about before with that forced migration and the Trail of Tears. Remember, we talked about all the Indian treaties, hopefully, and the Indian removal acts that took place. Hopefully you remember some of that from Miss Gandy as well, right? And the Native Americans wound up on these reservations with really terrible land. I mean, you can't grow anything on that land. And the government said, that's okay, we'll take care of you. You guys just hang tight. And what ended up happening was, they were waiting on the government for their food because, the white people had chased off all the buffalo and just killed them and slaughtered them. And they put them on this land, you can't grow anything. And then they're waiting for the government to essentially give them food, and the government would show up, if they showed up at all, with food with bugs in it. It would have maggots in it, or it would be inedible, or they wouldn't show up at all. Okay, now what's happened is over time is a lot of these places, a lot of these reservations the people have stayed on the reservation, but they're some of the poorest, some of the least educated, highest alcohol, what am I trying to say? Highest alcoholic rates of almost any ethnic group in the United States. All right, leave you on that fun note there.
So here we're looking at London. All right, you can't really tell by the shape of it, but what they're talking about is how people will cluster in an area. When we first moved to Lodi, East Lodi was German. Okay, Central Avenue, you saw German signs, German shops. Everybody's grandparents lived over there. Go over there and they, cook for friends and I. All right, they were fascinated by me. But then they moved on. Okay, now you see Latin American groups moving in, mostly Mexican, but you also see people coming from Asia. You see people from Pakistan moving into enclaves in that area. Same thing in London. Former colonies, people from former colonies, the best and the brightest come for education. Maybe they want to become some kind of pop star or whatever. London is like the place. So you'll see people coming up from former colonies, Nigeria, a lot of Nigerians in London. But over here, you can see, let's see, we got Asian enclaves. Oh, Asian enclaves on the left, all right, and you see black enclaves on the right. There's a joke. What does London smell like? Curry, okay? Because you've got so many people coming over from a former British colony, India, and coming for school, education, whatnot, and to work in hotels and restaurants and things like that. You know, young people coming and trying to get their chance. Ooh, I moved on to the next one. I don't even know how I did that. All right, Chicago, in the turn of the century, well, 1900 turn of the century, there were 57 different language newspapers in Chicago. Chicago was a meatpacking town. It was an urban area where people would come to work. And at that time, people were coming from Eastern Europe. You did have other, peoples, but it was a huge Eastern European area. You had all these little ethnic enclaves in town. If you go there today, what's fascinating is there's still, you can see, a little bit German, and whatnot. But now this blue is African American, people coming from the South in World Wars I and II to work in the factories, work in meatpacking. But this burnt orange area or yellowish area, that's Mexican. And when you're in Chicago and you know the history of it, and you see a lot of Mexicans, you're like, all right. Well, those are the people working in hotels and restaurants and hospitality right now, and gardening and things like that. But Chicago has changed. And what's interesting is, where did we see Anglo-American? Is actually, it's like people who've really lost their identity. What am I? Well, I'm American, I'm white, all right? And you see that, and we always have fun watching Chicago Cubs games because that's on the north side, and that's, where most of the white people live, versus watching a White Sox game, you see on the south side, all right, you see more of an ethnic mix, okay? Alrighty. Okay, and here it shows the ethnic enclaves of Chicago. If you look back at 1910, it was very European, all right, very Eastern European. You saw a smattering of Latin Americans, Mexico, here's the Turkey. But then today, look at the green Mexico compared to 1910, right there, all right? And it's about labor, who's willing to come and take those menial jobs. And there's always a new group that's willing to do that.
Here we're talking about ethnically complex Brazil. Mr. Wright was talking about the census earlier, and here you can see that the government likes to basically split Brazilians into two camps. Brancos, and yes, I didn't mispronounce Blanco, but Branco. Why Branco? Because the Portuguese settled Brazil, okay? And that's the Portuguese version of white. And then Pardos would be brown, and then you can see blacks, okay? So basically the government's trying to give two categories, but if you ask someone from Brazil, and people actually did this, there were 143 separate ethnic groups that people identified with. A lot of this goes back to colonialism and to Spanish days, when people who, basically the darker skinned you were, the less power in society you had, the less social status you had. And that meant limiting job opportunities, that meant mistreatment or better treatment if you were lighter or darker skin, things like that. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the distribution, okay? Where are these different groups clustered? And you're gonna find that we talked about slavery, about 12.5 million slaves. Like I said, only like 5% of them ended up in the colonies. Most of those slaves ended up in South America. So you're gonna find there's gonna be a lot of former slaves in Brazil, okay? So where are different ethnic groups distributed? Whites are largely distributed, and by the way, if you did a survey, and people have done a survey of Ancestry.com, that kind of a thing, about 70% of all Brazilians are European, okay? So that meant there was a lot of mixing that was taking place, okay, over the years. So down here in the southern part, you can see that is 60% or more white. Why is that? Well, this used to be the destination vacation for a lot of Europeans, okay? So a lot of beach towns, you had the capital was here, okay, for a long time, and they developed resorts. And so Europe, white people from Europe came over and settled in these areas here, okay? If you go into the interior, I'm gonna jump north, way up here, and you can see Amazonas right here. Up here would be the Amazonian jungle, and those folks are considered brown, okay? More indigenous though, okay? And then you're also gonna find a large segment over here of people who would be former slaves. When the Portuguese came and they brought their slaves in, this area here, this coast, was the first area that they really developed and settled. And so you're going to still find a large population, a large African population there, or folks with African roots from there.
Where the sugarcane was.
Okay, so sugarcane. What other kind of crops?
Sugarcane was big.
Yeah.
I think they did some coffee, but sugarcane was, they needed the labor. That was the big draw of bringing so many Africans over, was because that sugarcane was so labor intensive.
Yeah, it's interesting. They actually did a lot of work with, I don't have my Europe map up, but off the coast of Spain, they set up colonies and they practiced what would a sugarcane colony look like. Okay, how would you produce it? And they brought slaves up there and they worked it, and before they tried it out in the Americas. They didn't want to spend all their money. Okay, so right in here in the middle, you're gonna find a huge mix of all Brazilians there. Thank you, Mr. Ryan.
Well, you don't get a good picture.
Yeah,
you didn't get all of this.
That's okay. This one will do. It's pretty zoomed in here. So when we get to the political unit, we'll talk about forward capital and how the capital's moved in here to Brasilia. And what ends up happening is you have a mixture of a lot of different ethnicities moving into this area because everyone wants to work in the capital. Okay, so white people, brown, white, and black people, brown people in here, and then larger black population here.
And when you say white, you mean Portuguese.
When I say white, I mean European. Yeah, Portuguese. Okay. All right. So if we travel north, okay. Oh, where's my lap there? Oh, sorry. It's all right. South America. So if we travel north from Brazil, you wind up in Guyana. Okay. It's this small country. It's about the size of Kansas. Okay, but it's very, very diverse. Starts out as a Dutch colony, and the Dutch bring African Americans as slaves to settle. And you can see sort of the distribution of the different ethnic groups. Okay, so the Dutch settle first. They bring the Africans, and you can see these purple spots here. Those would be African ethnic enclaves. Okay, let's see. The 19th century, the Dutch basically trade off Guyana to the British. And the British, at that time, they were heavily colonizing India. And so they bring Indian indentured servants with them, right? So they're house, I was gonna say house elves. I went Harry Potter on you, okay? But they're house slaves, or the people who were working, their servants and things like that. They brought them to help settle places like this, like Georgetown, right? So you can see toponyms here too. Georgetown would be British, right? And then New Amsterdam, obviously more Dutch. But the orange part here, it says East Indian. So that's kind of interesting, right? Here in South America, you have this East Indian population. And then of course, over here towards the Amazonian rainforest, you have a lot of Amerindian, okay, or indigenous people living there.
Brazil. So we were at a track meet, Mount Sac Relays down in LA, and we're staying at a hotel with the Brazilian Olympic team, or their national team at that point. And the coaches were Portuguese and the athletes were African American, but they didn't look like our African Americans because they came from different places in Africa.